Hello and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Founders and Pytel Awards session on day 2 of the virtual ASB 2021 annual meeting, and we're so happy to have you here. I'm the ASB Awards Chair, and I'm so glad you're joining us to hear the inspirational talks of our award winners today. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Karen Troy, the 2021 Founders Award recipient, and Dr. Jerry Wu, the 2021 Jean Landa Pytel Diversity Mentoring Award recipient. During and after the talks, please put your questions in the chat as I'll be moderating those questions right after the individual speakers end. And to begin, we'll start with the Founders Award talk, and I'll introduce Karen Troy. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karen Troy as a Founders Award winner for 2021. The Founders Award is given to recognize scientific accomplishment in biomechanics and excellence in mentoring, and is open to ASB members who are between 5 and 20 years post their terminal degree. Karen is a professor of biomedical engineering at Worcester Polytechnic University. She directs the musculoskeletal biomechanics lab, which studies how mechanical loads or lack thereof can be both beneficial and harmful to bone, and aims to understand what conditions influence whether a load helps or hurts a person. Her work has been influential in how we understand bone loss in individuals with spinal cord injury, individuals with osteoporosis, and bone health in athletes. She's well published and well funded and gives an incredible amount of time to service activities in this society and at her university and beyond. And to exemplify her excellence in mentoring, I will quote one of her former trainees, Dr. Megan Mancuso, who states, "Karen taught me how to ask important questions, balance the small details and big picture, and to conduct safe, ethical human subjects research. It was clear she viewed her relationships with students as a working partnership and wanted to help each of us reach our full potential." And I think we can all agree we could all use some mentoring like that. And as was stated by Paul DeVita yesterday in the Borelli session, biomechanics is really about helping people, and Karen does that through her research and her mentoring. So on behalf of the ASB community, I congratulate Karen for this award, and we look forward to hearing and learning from you today, Karen.
All right, thank you for a really nice introduction. Hopefully this all goes, oops, shoot, you know what, wait a minute. I gotta redo that because I have to click a button. Oh no, I did it, good, okay. Come on. All right, so I wanted to start, I want to first start by talking a little bit about the ASB, and we go way back to the UIC dorms, which used to be how we spent our time at ASB conferences. So that was my first ASB conference, and I don't think I've missed too many since, maybe one when I had a 6-week-old baby. And I actually had a good time looking on the internet for old pictures, and then I realized that was a mistake. But I was able to find this picture from 2013, which was the first year that I served on the exec board as treasurer. And one of the things that I really enjoy about the society is just the absolute friendliness of it, the supportiveness of it, and especially working with the leadership. It's just an absolute privilege to be in the same room as so many brilliant and kind and wonderful and talented people. So thank you all for your support over the years. So I want to talk a little bit about what I do and how I ended up where I got. So my interest is really in the interactions between physical activity and musculoskeletal health. And we look over a continuum of disuse to overuse injuries and everything in between. And we're really thinking about bones and joints and how they're loaded when real people do real things, and then how those loads manifest as changes in bone and joint structure and health. And through that process, we've had to develop a number of tools related to quantitative imaging and computational modeling because we're working in real people. And so I thought I would just go through some of the many fun projects which are sometimes appear to be related, sometimes appear to be unrelated, but they've all shaped the science that I do. And so I'm going to start with emus. So emus were my dissertation project, and we were really looking at these large animal models to try and understand the process of necrotic femoral head collapse. So I started working in bone and hips, One of the first tasks was to develop surgical procedures to repeatably produce osteonecrosis of the femoral head. And so I developed a cryoprobe as part of that project. You can see a fluoroscopic image of it here. And then had to figure out a quantitative way to figure out whether the cells had actually died or not within the femoral head. We also had to understand what the difference was between emu hip joint biomechanics and human hip joint biomechanics. And so I did a fair bit of mechanical testing. So here's a test setup, and then tried to understand what the contact stress distributions on emu femoral heads looked like over the gait cycle. So this work was all done under the supervision of Tom Brown, who was my doctoral mentor. And I learned a lot of things in the lab, but one of the things that really stuck with me that he said pretty early on when I handed him a spreadsheet of results that was off by about 2 orders of magnitude is he said, you know, Karen, you could really work on your attention to detail. And that hit pretty hard. And I have strived ever since then to work on my attention to detail. So after I finished grad school, I did a little bit of a mini career change, and I started to work with Mark Grabner on the biomechanics of fall avoidance. And we were primarily interested in slip-related falls at the time. So we had a study in which people, older and younger adults, would come into the lab, and we had sort of a quasi-prospective study design in which they would walk across the lab through the motion capture area. And at some point, they would experience an unexpected slip. And the goal of the studies was to understand what distinguishes people who avoid falling from those who fall after a slip. And this was quite a fun study to do. I'll show you a series of videos here, which may look familiar because I believe Mark showed the same video clip as part of his Borelli Award talk a few years ago. But you can see that we had a slippery substance which was placed on this piece of plexiglass, and the slippery substance was generally either mineral oil or personal lubricant. And so we always got a pretty good laugh out of asking one of the graduate students to walk across the street to the grocery store to go get large quantities of those 2 items, which she found terribly embarrassing. One of the key things that we learned from this study is we actually started off, and you can see it in the background here, by using a slipping platform, which gave very well-controlled slips. So you could control the distance, you could control the direction of the slip. And we eventually moved to this plexiglass system, which was much less constrained. And the reason that we did that is because we determined that these surrogate slips, which you see on the left here, really were quite biomechanically different from actual slips in terms of what it took to recover from them. So through this research, we determined that there were a couple of key factors that distinguished people who fell from those who didn't fall. One was the ability to get that non-slipping foot down on the ground behind you very quickly, really before your your slipping foot slid out in front of you. So that's your foot velocity relative to your center of mass velocity. And the other item was that when you got that non-slipping foot down behind you, you really had to get it directly behind you and not off to the side. Because if you put it off to the side, you would almost certainly fall, and the fall was often sideways. So the other thing that we got to work on in this lab was a little bit of a clinical translation project. And so Mark's lab worked on slips and trips and all sorts of other types of falling tasks. And we had a prototype of the active step treadmill, which I think a number of you see maybe have used in your lab now. And this has now been translated into some training protocols to help older adults avoid falling. And you can see from this video clip, which I hope you got a little bit of a chuckle out of, that I learned a lot of things. One of the policies in the lab that we developed was to always keep a video camera on because you never knew what you'll catch. But I also learned that research can be fun and that it's really important just to ask lots of questions and try out lots of things. And most of the questions are not good questions, but you have to ask 100 bad ones to find the right good one. And Mark also really emphasized to me that just because something wasn't statistically significant didn't mean that it wasn't clinically significant. And so it's always important to keep clinical relevance in mind if you're working with people in particular. So as we were working on older adults and looking at people falling and almost falling, I got pretty interested in what they were doing with their hands. And I noticed that from some old video clips of people falling after a trip, that their hands were really all over the place. And anybody who's tripped and fell knows that you reflexively will put your hands out, but they actually land quite asymmetrically. And I noticed when we slipped people that their arms would fly up in the air. And there seemed to be a biomechanical reason for that. And so we determined that really the way the hands move to break a fall was definitely very asymmetrical and resulted in non-axial loading. And the way that people move their arms up in the air was actually a mechanism to prevent trunk extension. And so it can actually help you reduce slip-related falls. So all of this got me interested in fall-related fractures, because of course, if you can't avoid that fall, then your hand is going to go down and you'll land on it, and you often will end up with a distal radius fracture. So these fractures are super common, the most common type of fracture in older adults. And so at this point, I kind of dug back into my repertoire of techniques that I had learned in grad school and decided that it might be useful to do some modeling to understand a little bit more about how fall direction and bone mechanics really played into fracture risk. So I asked the question, what factors are most important for avoiding distal radius fractures after a fall? And one of the key findings was that loading direction matters a lot. So here's an example of a finite element model of a distal radius that we came up with. You can see the scaphoid and the lunate, which are the first carpal row, are actually what press onto the radius. And over here, the key results show us that axial loads had much higher fracture strengths than off-axis loads. And that didn't matter. You could increase or decrease the bone density on average, and that's what these other two lines show us. But that was not nearly as important as having the correct loading direction. And so that made me think, okay, well, what actually makes a bone strong? So we have macrostructure, right? There's the overall bone size and shape and the thickness of the cortex. We've got microstructure, which are these small scale features like trabecular microstructure and porosity of the cortical bone. Oh, and apparently this is now going to lag. Come on. Okay, we'll wait just a moment. There is a picture that will appear as soon as my image is done lagging. There we go. Okay. And so you can see an example of sort of a strong bone on the top of each of these images versus a weaker bone on the bottom. And so I got very interested in understanding why do bones get this way when they started out this way, and what can we do about it? Well, about that time, I had the privilege of having Brent Edwards join my lab as a postdoc. And I was a very new faculty member at the time. Brent had just graduated, so he was really only a couple of years younger than me. And I made a deal with him at the time, which is I said, look, we're a team here. And if you make me look good, I will make you look good. And I'm happy to say that he made me look very good and did some really fantastic work while he was in the lab. So one of the questions that I first tasked him on was to validate these finite element models. And the first question was, what do we need to, do we actually need to be modeling this contact between the carpal bone and the radius? And the answer is yes. If you don't model it, then the fracture mechanics are actually very different between the bones. So at that point, then we took whole hands and we did some mechanical testing on them. And you can see some very nice strain gauge work that Brent did here. And then here's what the fractures ended up looking like on these distal radii. And when we created models based on CT images of these bones, you can see that we were able to fairly well predict where the fracture was going to happen with the models. So this work was actually continued by Varun Bhatia, who was my first PhD student, and then later on by Joshua Johnson, who joined my lab as a postdoc in 2013. And the work continued as Joshua developed a multi-scale version of this model to include bone microstructure, and Varun did some additional modeling to understand bone surface strain so that we could understand a little bit more about how bones were being loaded in the body. So all of this started with a question that we asked about whether we could actually make bones stronger. And about the time that we started this work, there was a lot of in vivo loading models coming out, a lot of information, a lot of new studies coming out about bone adaptation. And the general theory is that most of our life, our bone is in equilibrium. It's constantly turning over due to various mechanical stimuli, but there's no net formation or resorption. But if you add some sort of novel mechanical stimulus, then you can experience a hypertrophic response, so formation in net. If you take away that mechanical stimulus, for example, after spinal cord injury or space flight, you can have an atrophy or a net resorption response. And it doesn't really matter in this case what the stimulus is. We know that there are a number of different mechanisms by which osteocytes sense that stimulus. For our purposes of looking at whole bone mechanics, what we cared about was the fact that they're all either directly or indirectly related to mechanical strain. And so that's the surrogate measure that we use. And so here's an example of some of the work that was coming out. So here's data from a mouse tibia loading model showing that loading rate, higher loading rates resulted in more bone formation than low loading rates. At the time, there was also some observational data that came out in racket sports players looking at proximal humerus, or actually this is mid-humerus. And you can see that the racket arm has a much thicker, stronger bone than the non-racket arm. And that again is a result of that mechanical stimulus that's being applied throughout their lifetime. And if you think about some examples of these in vivo loading models, here's a rat ulna loading model. And so we decided that maybe we could make a human radius loading model, which would involve leaning on the palm of your hand in a voluntary way, maybe with a sound cue to tell you, and then having some sort of feedback so that you could hit the target force. And what we needed then were some non-invasive tools to measure things. And so this was all to answer the question of what if we could design exercises to be osteogenic. And so again, around this time, a number of different formulas were being proposed to try and predict how much bone you could get based on the mechanical input. And all of these were based on animal models for the most part. None of them had ever been prospectively validated in humans. And so we were really interested in understanding whether these same rules actually applied in people. So we needed some new tools to answer the questions. So again, working with Brent, we developed quantitative CT techniques to measure changes in bone mass and structure and strength. We did a lot of validation of subject-specific finite element modeling methods so that we could predict bone mechanics under certain types of loads. Eventually, we were able to acquire instrumentation for high-resolution imaging to measure changes in the microstructure, and you can see an example of that here. But especially when we started doing quantitative CT, it was quite expensive, and I was a little afraid of spending my startup package. And then a very wise mentor of mine named Carol Braunschweig told me, Karen, money is like manure. It sits in a pile and stinks. Spread it around and make things grow. And so I really took that to heart, and I spent all of my startup, which was a little scary because I didn't know where the next, how I was going to pay for anything after that. We screwed up a lot before we learned how to do it right, but we were eventually able to get some really good, reliable techniques, which I think are being quite widely used now. So through this process, we developed kind of a conceptual approach for mechanistic clinical trials to study bone adaptation. And the idea is that you identify whatever anatomic structure you're interested in. You have to understand how it's actually being loaded during the activity that you're interested in. And then you can create a patient-specific finite element model through imaging and by applying those loads. And then you take that model, oh, there we go, which is going to give you information about bone stresses and strains during your activity. And now you have maybe a clinical trial that you're interested in. So you measure the bone quantity and structure before an intervention. You have to come up with some sort of loading dose metric that is occurring due to the intervention. And it could be your bone stresses and strains times the number of cycles, for example. And then you have to, of course, measure the bone quality and structure post-intervention and look at the changes. And with that data now, you can start to ask questions about the relationship between your loading dose or your loading stimulus and the changes, both at the whole bone level and at the local level. And if your bone is adapting, then you're expected to gain bone, or you could even start to move that into looking at bone injury. So the first mechanistic clinical trial that we did then was to understand how strain magnitude and strain rate affected bone adaptation in healthy adults. And so this was a randomized clinical trial that enrolled 102 healthy adult women. They should, at this age range, be at peak bone mass. And so everybody's bone, in theory, should be at this equilibrium state. And the idea was to give everyone an intervention using this distal radius loading model, so leaning on the palm of your hand, and push them into this hypertrophy zone. And we had 5 different groups. There was a strain, low and high strain magnitude groups, low and high strain rate groups, and a control group that just continued on with their daily activities. And I want to briefly acknowledge the contributions of Megan Mancuso, who was my PhD student, who did a tremendous amount of work on this. Joshua Johnson, who again was a postdoc at the time and also did a huge amount of work on this clinical trial. Tiffany Butler was another postdoc in my lab who did a fair bit of work on the trial and helped a lot with study coordination. And then Sabahat Ahmed was our clinical trial coordinator for the majority of the time. So what was interesting about this study is that rather than just giving everybody the same intervention, we tried to give them a subject-specific intervention. So we assigned everybody a target strain or strain rate based on their group. And then we got a CT image of their wrist, and we created a subject-specific finite element model so that we could determine for their particular anatomy how much force was required to achieve that target strain. And that was then plugged into a little loading device, which had a data logger and some lights that lit up when you hit the target. And then that loading device recorded what they actually did, and we could plug their achieved force then back into this finite element model to understand how much strain they actually achieved. And so we had what we theoretically told them to do, but then we also knew what they actually did. And the primary outcomes here that I'm going to talk about were change in bone mineral content at the distal radius, which is just how much bone in total do you have. So what we found was that the forearm loading in general was osteogenic, which is great. So here's a control group. You can see in general, they actually lost a bit of bone. The low magnitude group did gain a little bit of bone, and then the low rate and high rate groups actually gained quite a bit more bone, sort of in the 4 to 6% range. And just for perspective, that would be quite a good response. Like if you gave an older woman an osteoporotic drug and she had a 4% gain in bone mass, you'd be a very happy doctor. So when we started to look at why this was happening, because it was not what we hypothesized, we were hoping that the high rate and high magnitude groups would have a bigger response. You can see that the strain magnitude was not all that different between the groups. The strain rate did differ, but you can see that both the high magnitude and high rate groups had similar rates. You can see that compliance varied widely across individuals. And as a result, the dose, which we calculated as the product of these 3 items, was also quite different. And so unfortunately, the mechanical loading was really confounded with participant compliance here. So we looked at the data one other way, which is that we divided the participants into tertiles by how much bone they had gained or lost. And so you can see here the change after 1 year in bone. So here's the top tertile, which on average gained about 3.8%. The bottom tertile lost about 2%. And by design, those are significantly different. And when we examined all of the characteristics between those 3 groups, we found that the only things that differed were factors having to do with the mechanical stimulus. So the top tertile had higher strain magnitude, higher strain rate, more loading sessions, and a larger loading dose than the bottom tertile. So that was pretty exciting. So I'm going to move on and talk about another project which happened around the same time, and that is, it was approached by a doctor named Tom Schnitzer, who was over at Northwestern, and he studied individuals with spinal cord injury, and he was looking for somebody who could do some good quantitative bone analysis on some of his projects. And so we started a project together to look at how bone changed after acute spinal cord injury. So those with spinal cord injury, as I mentioned, have an unloading stimulus, and on average, they lose bone very rapidly for the first few years. And we wanted to understand where that was happening and what the mechanical consequences were. And so this is work that Brent and Tom and I did together. You can see here that this is now loss in bone mineral content per month. And within the first few weeks of spinal cord injury, you're losing about 6% of your cortical bone per month. here. So it's a huge and rapid loss. And similarly, when you look at proximal femur changes, you can see that every single individual person would lost proximal femur strength. And this was done through finite element modeling that Brent did. So one of the things that I learned from Tom is that just to never forget that when you're measuring these things on patients and research volunteers, these are real people. And it's really important to just remember that, you know, these are real people with real problems and they matter, and to not just get too caught up in your data, but always remember the person. So one of the questions we asked as we were going through this is whether you could use patient-specific finite element models and quantitative CT as an outcome measure to evaluate whether an osteoporosis treatment went well. So the first thing we had to do was validate some models that were relevant for people with spinal cord injury. And people with spinal cord injury often will get fractures in their proximal tibia, and they're often spiral fractures. So we got to break a bunch of bones, which was super fun. You can see some of the torque rotation curves that we measured experimentally, and then the red dashed line here is what our finite element models were predicting. So we were able to get models that were pretty accurate. And then we were able to use those models to understand what was happening in some clinical trials. So the first thing we did was we looked at that acute bone loss, and then we simulated some different drug treatments. And then eventually we had a couple of different clinical trials looking at pharmaceutical and mechanical vibration as an intervention, and then also trying to understand how bone strength changes over time since since spinal cord injury. And again, this was all work that Brent did while he was in my lab, and then shortly following that. So about this time, I moved to Worcester Polytechnic Institute and gained a new collaborator in Leslie Morse. She's another physical medicine and rehab doctor who was interested in bone and spinal cord injury. And I had the privilege of working on a couple of clinical trials with her. So the first one looked at functional electrical stimulated assisted rowing. And I thought this was a super cool model system, because now here's a situation where you actually know exactly what the bone loading is. Right? So you know that if a person is paralyzed and you're giving an electrical stimulation to the quadriceps and the hamstrings, those are the only muscles that are being turned on, and you know when they're being turned on. And so my graduate student, Ying Fang, got an ASB Grant and Aid Award to instrument up one of the adapted treadmills and to actually do some of the biomechanics work on the knee loading during functional electrical stimulation assisted rowing. So we did that, and we also got quantitative CT imaging and did finite element modeling on these participants. And what we found was that sadly the rowing didn't load the bones nearly as much as we thought it was going to, and it was not terribly effective in preserving bone strength, although the zoledronic acid, which is an anti-resorptive, was quite effective. So eventually, all of this work has culminated in my ability to participate in a couple of different task forces and to really define some bone density testing and clinical practice guidelines for people with spinal cord injury. So I think, again, thinking about clinical impact, it's just, you know, super important to be able to translate this research into something practical that people who are actually caring for these patients can use. And this is important because before this position was generated in 2019, there were no guidelines about how to care for bone health in this population that gets very high fracture rates. So I learned a lot of things working with Leslie, and I continue to work with her. But one of the things is that the best collaborators really have overlapping interests, but different expertise. And so she's been great to work with, and her husband is a bone biologist. And so between the three of us, we really have a nice complementary expertise. And she also said to me one day, I only work with nice people. It's just not worth my time to work with people who are jerks. And I think that's another good life lesson and a take-home message. There are a lot of great scientists out there. So, you know, if you don't like working with somebody, you could probably find somebody with similar expertise who's nicer. So Leslie and I currently have an ongoing clinical trial looking at exoskeleton assisted walking therapy in people with spinal cord injury. And I put this little smiley face here because I had a master's student, Nicole Matson, who just graduated this past May and has done a lot of work on this. And Nicole has done something that I think is quite amazing for a 24-year-old woman, which is that I cannot find a picture of her on the internet. So go Nicole. Any case, So the study design is really looking at a 6-month exoskeleton assisted walking intervention. And the questions that we're asking have to do with bone gain again. So we think that this may load the knees in a very particular way, which could be osteogenic. And then the question is, does that response depend on loading dose? And so going back to our framework, we need to understand what are the loads, and then how much does the bone change? So I thought I would just show you guys a couple of videos here. So we actually have people walking in 2 different exoskeletons. This is the Indego here. And this is actually the same participant walking in the Ekso here. So they're slightly different designs. They have slightly different control systems. And there are some significant differences in the gait biomechanics between the 2 of them, which in this case we quantified with video analysis and some pressure sensing insoles. And I'll just say that there's more about this particular project. So Nicole's poster is being presented tomorrow afternoon if you'd like to go learn more. Oh, and one other thing, which is that we do not have the bone outcomes yet because we are still blinded on the clinical trial. So this has all been, I think, a pretty varied career, but I think the theme is, again, working with people, working with bone, and really trying to understand this interaction between the physical loads and the bone. And over the last couple of years, I've had the privilege of working with a few new folks and developing some new projects. One is I spent a sabbatical year over with Irene Davis and Adam 1040. And there we've started to develop some nice projects looking at how metatarsals are loaded in runners and why some people get stress fractures and others don't. So that's a very cool project. This past summer, I had the privilege of doing the delayed part of the last part of my sabbatical over at ETH in Zurich and working with Ralph Mueller on some computational modeling and simulation of bone adaptation to really understand a little bit more about the biology and the mechanisms by which bone is changing. So I'm hoping that those can be added to my very windy path. So along the way, I've developed a few guiding principles for myself, and I thought I'd share them just because I can. So one of the things is, how do I pick a research project, right? So I seem a little scattered sometimes, but I think the key thing is I have to love it, right? It has to be something that I'm interested in, because otherwise there's actually nothing worse than getting a project funded that you're not interested in, because then you have to work on it. And this happened to me once, and I don't recommend it. The second thing is, what am I actually able to do, right? What are the techniques that I have? What are the resources that I have? What are the resources that I'm able to get? And what expertise do I need to bring in through collaboration? And the third thing is, what's actually important and what's significant? What are the good questions that you need to ask? And so I'm always looking for this overlap to try and figure out where my research needs to fit in. What's the next project that I should be working on? So a couple of other things I always tell everybody in my lab: work hard, play hard. So I really try and keep a very clear balance in my life between I love my work and I do a lot of it, but then I leave and I go on, vacations, and I don't check my email. And I think it's really important just to take a break sometimes. Find good collaborators. Absolutely. One of the key things that has worked with me, it has helped me to be successful, is working with great people. Ask good questions always. Never stop learning. So even if you can always expand this bubble of what am I able to do by learning and not being afraid to learn new areas of science. But I think the key thing is that your trainees' success is your success. And so, as I said to Brent, we try to make each other look good. I tell that to every single one of the students that comes to work with me. And, my goal for them is for them to achieve their goals. So whatever it is that they want to do, I want to make sure that I'm giving them the experiences and the skills so that they can reach that goal. And I don't have a predetermined destination about what that means. It could be an industry job, it could be academic, it could be, I don't even care. But whatever it is, that's my job. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful, Karen. Thank you so much for sharing with us both your research path and then your guiding principles for how you've reached so much success in both areas of mentoring and research. So we've got a few questions starting to roll in, and I want to start with one because as awards chair, I had the pleasure of seeing your full application. I don't get to choose the winner, but I get to read all of these wonderful applications. And, you know, you talked about Brent Edwards and having this partnership with him. And he specifically commented how productive that time was. And my assumption was that research productivity and other growth areas, but I wonder if you could sort of comment on your sort of philosophy and productivity in that partnership with your students and how you guide that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one thing I think is that you've got to have good people, of course. So, you know, Brent is probably giving me more credit than it's worth because he's excellent. But I do think one of the things I did a couple things. So one is that I gave him quite a lot of freedom and flexibility. So you know, while I had a couple of missions and projects for him, you know, he had a lot of leeway in terms of what he was going to do. And so I really looked at it as my job was to help him develop his ideas as opposed to telling him what he had to do. And I try and do that to an extent with all my PhD students as well. Of course, you know, at the beginning, I think you need to be a little bit more prescriptive. And then as you grow as a scientist, you're able to find that path a little bit more clearly yourself. But I tend to be fairly hands-off unless I see that I need to be more hands-on. And another thing is that when I was a postdoc, Mark strongly encouraged me to write an NRSA fellowship, so like an F32 award, which I did, and I got funded. That was great. So, and that was a really good opportunity, I thought. So I have always worked with my students to try and write those fellowships. And I tell them, like, even if it doesn't get funded, you know, the act of going through and thinking very clearly about, like, what's my plan, what's my question, what do I want to do when I'm done? How is this going to, you know, how is this going to help feed into that? I think it's a really good exercise. And it's also a good exercise in improving your scientific communication. So I think fellowships are important.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So we've got a question about more of the scientific content, and back to the sort of tripping, falling studies, thanks for sharing those videos. They're always humorous and interesting. We got a comment that looks like some fun experiments. And do the participants know they're following with the oil, and then the assumption of, where I'm assuming the kinematics would be different between those conditions of knowing and not knowing?
Yeah, so it's actually a very tricky type of experiment to do ethically. And so what we do is we bring people in, they have a health screening, so we know we're not going to injure them. And I don't know if you caught it, but everybody's wearing a full body harness, so they don't actually hit the ground. They are all told that at some point during the experiment, they will be tripped or they will be slipped, but they're not told how or when that's going to occur. And so what we would do is sort of, you know, walk them back and forth and lull them into a false sense of security and basically get them bored with the process. And then, you know, we would, and they had motion capture markers on, and they had EMG on. And so stuff is always needs to be diddled with, right? And so right before they slipped them, we'd have somebody say, oh, you know, I gotta fix this marker on you, you know, turn around over here. Let me think with this thing. And while they did that, you know, somebody would be out there spreading the oil. And then they'd say, okay, you know, let's just go one more time, and, you know, we'll see if we can get this last one. And then, you know, then you get them. So.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
It was actually quite a fun set of experiments to do.
All right. So another question: what is the chief quality look for in good collaborators?
Good question. I would say so one is skills that are going to be complementary to mine. So you can't have somebody who has exactly the same background and skills. Chances are you're not going to really be able to, you're going to overlap too much, right? I think you need to have enough of a shared interest that you're interested in actually working on the same project. And the third thing is I really am looking for somebody who is willing to treat it as a partnership and really, you know, work together on all aspects of what you're working on. So that could be, you know, conceiving of the idea, I think there should be sort of a clear division of who's got what, what techniques that they're going to be using, but really, it's a partnership for me.
Awesome. All right, moving on to the next question. You've got a lot of congratulations in the chat, so if you take time, you should look at those. And but such a great talk. As a student, the guiding principles were extremely insightful, and I'll definitely be watching the recording to hear them again. Question: at what point in your career do you stop or slow down expansion of the what I can do circle? I know there is a balance between being an expert at a few things, knowledgeable in many, and having basic understanding of tons, but I'm not sure how to find kind of that sweet spot.
That is an excellent question. I will say, I think I probably would have had a very different career if I had taken a much more linear trajectory. And so you'll get a different answer from me than you will from somebody who did that, right? So I could have, done my Emus, gone to another orthopedics lab, and, I probably would have done just fine in that regard. But for me, I was interested, I really wanted to work with people. I wanted to learn how to do that. I've had some projects sort of drift into my door through opportunities that just came up, and other things that I've worked very hard to cultivate. So I think every time you do those projects, it probably takes you about 2 years to own another area, right? So as a graduate student, maybe it takes you about 3 or 4 to really become an expert in your area, because you're just learning how to assimilate that information. So I think you do want to be quite intentional about adding those new areas, and maybe think about how they relate to what you already know. So I'll give you one example, which is that back early on, when my grad student Barnes started working on in my lab, there was all this work in animal loading models, and I thought, oh, maybe we should do some of that, right? And so he said, I want to build something. I said, great, build me a mouse loading device. We'll try and do mice. And we started to build this thing, and he got it working, and we started to test some mice, and I realized I didn't like it. And there were like a bunch of other people who did it, and that I recognized that I had this skill set, right? Like I could do the modeling, I could do people, right? And I knew about bone. And so I was like, gosh, why am I wasting my time with mice when I can do people? Like none of the other mice people can do real people. So where's my unique contribution going to be? It's going to come from the combination of those skills and your interests, but it's up to you to figure out how you're going to find your little niche. And a lot of times it's because you're mixing disciplines in a way that's unique. So I would say, pick 2 or 3 things, work with that. And then if you decide you need to add some more skills, or some new areas, then, you can decide to invest the time in that.
That's a great answer, a good example with the mouse example. We've got a good follow-on question to that from one of our past presidents, Brian Umberger. Great presentation, Karen. Congrats on this well-deserved award. With your Venn diagram, there is potentially an additional factor of what topics are being funded. How do you balance that with the other factors?
Not very well is the short answer. But I do think it kind of comes down to the what is important, right? And I think to some extent, if you feel like it's important, then you've just got to figure out how to convince everybody else that it is important. And I do think at some point there's a time to sort of take a project that you think is important, but you just like, I'm actually about to do this for one of my projects, right? Like I think I might have just hit the wall, right? Where I'm like, okay, I've tried to convince the reviewers this is important. They're clearly not getting it. I may just set it aside and move on to something else that I think is easier to convince people. And maybe I'll continue to work on it on the side as in a low budget kind of way. But and at the same time, though, I think you do need to be aware, right? There are opportunities. So funding, especially funding calls that are time sensitive, there are opportunities. And the question is it an opportunity that I want? And is it an opportunity that overlaps with the, am I interested and can I do it, right? So it's like, there's money, am I interested and can I do it? If you've got only one of those two, do not do it, right? You have to be interested and you have to be able to do it And there has to be the money in order for you to bother to go for that, I think.
That's fantastic. Great answer. And I think maybe many of us sort of, depending on where we work, kind of felt some of that, especially with the COVID funding and other things this past year of whether we're going to divert and try something. But that's really grounding, guidance there on go back to those two things. So thank you, Karen. And I just want to thank you overall for this wonderful presentation. We're going to shift to our next presenter now, but this was great, and I'm so glad we have a recording of this that we can go back to remind us of your guiding principles.
Thanks.
All right, so everybody, now we get another fantastic talk, and balances really well with these two awards since the Founders has a large mentoring component. And now we're moving on to the Pytel Award, which is really focused in mentoring. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jerry Wu as the Pytel Award winner for 2021. The Landa Pytel Diversity Mentoring Award recognizes the long-term impact of mentoring on both the careers of individual scientists, including women and individuals from other traditionally underrepresented backgrounds in ASB, and the ultimate betterment of our society as a whole. Jerry is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health at Georgia State University. Jerry's research has been focused on understanding the biomechanical patterns of movement in children with and without disabilities, and investigating the effect of physical intervention on motor and cognitive development in children with disabilities such as Down syndrome and cerebral palsy. Jerry is the director of the Biomechanics Lab and the director of the Center for Movement and Rehabilitation Research. Jerry's mentors both undergraduate and graduate students and throws in some high school experiences as well. And they are all from various academic backgrounds and across race and ethnic backgrounds. His mentoring philosophy resonates with the diversity focus of Georgia State University, as it is one of the most diverse universities in the United States. Through Jerry's mentoring, his students have been very successful with presentations and publishing. And to demonstrate Jerry's commitment to mentoring students from diverse backgrounds, let's hear from some of his trainees. I've pulled out a few quotes from the application materials. So first quote, as a foreigner settling into a foreign land for the first time in a new field, I still remember the warm welcome I felt when I met Dr. Wu for my orientation meeting. The passion he had for biomechanics and for the research was contagious. He took me under his wing from the beginning, praised my past accomplishments, and also shared an understanding of my potential struggles adjusting to the new environment, both personally and academically. Second quote, Dr. Wu ensured his students, even undergraduate students, had the opportunities to engage in research. He thoughtfully nurtured his students to help them develop a range of research skills by having them co-lead research projects and navigate the critical stages of research. And these skills prepared my lab colleagues and me for faculty and research positions. And then our third last quote here, Dr. Wu ran an extremely diverse lab, taking on students from different genders, ethnicities, and a variety of academic and professional backgrounds. Each student was celebrated for their unique perspective. Dr. Wu encouraged us to learn from one another and collaborate rather than compete. It's clear that Jerry prioritizes his role as a thoughtful and supportive mentor who recognizes his trainees as a holistic person that they are, which is completely in the spirit of the Pytel Award. So on behalf of the ASB community, congratulations, Jerry, for this reward. And we look forward from learning from you today.
Thank you so much, Miss. So let me share my screen. All right, actually, I'm a little nervous. I was really humbled and honored to accept this award. So when I was told that I need to give like 30 minutes presentation, I was a little panicked because I'm used to give like research presentation, but not this kind of like mentorship presentation. So this is also new to me. I'm looking around, I can see that I'm not the best researcher out there, and I may not be the best teacher out there, but somehow I was awarded for this award. And so I need to bring something to the table to share with you my experience in terms of diversity, mentorship. And so hopefully that, by listening to Karen's talk, she has excellent guiding principles. I feel like, oh, I don't have one. And so I need to come up with something which can be shared with you. So I looked up Dr. Landa Pytel's work in the diversity mentorship. And I was amazed by how much she has done in this field. And so especially I want to say that, so she has promoted women achievement and science and engineering, and also provide undergraduate students with excellent experience, and also promoting engineering education and international outreach. So I have done something in each of these three areas. So I feel like I can share with you my experience, even though I don't feel like I'm on par with Dr. Pytel's achievements. It's all started with my humble background. I was born in a media science city in China. So the map here shows the location of my hometown. My parents were working in a state-run iron and steel factory. And people actually came from different places of Southeast China. And so, as you may know, people in China speak different dialects and languages. And so in order for them to work together, everybody has to speak the same language, Mandarin, which is official language in China. So at a really young age, I realized people can be so different. They can speak, they can have different lifestyles. They can speak different languages. But in order to work together, you have to find common ground. You have to speak the same language, people can understand you. And so that actually tells me that, even though we have sort of diversity in China there, but we can actually work together and achieve the common goal. And so this is really like at my really young age, I get first glimpse of like diversity. And so I went to college in Hangzhou, which is the most beautiful city, I think, in China. Then after that, I went to graduate school in Shanghai. Shanghai is international city, even in 20, 30 years ago. So my classmates were from all over the country. So that's my second experience with diversity. I know now people can be so much different, but again, we can share the same interest, we can have the common ground to succeed as a group. So after I graduated with my master's degree, I went to University of California, Davis, and for my PhD study. And after that, I went to University of Michigan for my postdoc training. So at the University of Davis, I truly get the sense of diversity in the United States. I met my friends who are Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, Asian. There are just so many different races there. I was amazed by the mixture of all of those races. They work together harmoniously on the campus. And during my postdoc training, I started working with people with disabilities, especially children with Down syndrome. That helped me to realize that diversity is not about races anymore. Actually, it should include people with disabilities, because those people have so many barriers in their lives, and they need to overcome this barrier in order to, kind of be successful in society. So all of those wonderful experiences teach me diversity, and certainly my definition of diversity changes over time. But I get better understanding about the diversity. I started my faculty position at the Georgia State University in 2007 as an assistant professor. And I stayed at the same university since then, and I got promoted to the associate professor. Georgia State University is one of the most diverse universities in the United States. We have more than 54,000 students from more than 167 nations and territories. And that's just a wonderful place. You learn diversity, you practice diversity, and actually you educate students. So we have more than 40% of students who are African Americans. So each year we graduate the highest number of African-American students in the United States. So we are really proud of that achievement. But also we are R1 urban research university. So research is one of our priorities. We need to do the research, not only just to fulfill our job duties, but also to benefit the Atlanta area and the whole country. I was fortunate and to learn different skill sets, and I have engineer background from my bachelor, master, and PhD education. And so for my doctoral study, I focused on biomechanical patterns of human movement. Then in my postdoc training, I expanded my research agenda to include pediatric rehabilitation and to study with the children with disabilities. So I consider myself as a biomechanist who is focused on neuromotor development and pediatric rehabilitation. So I'm not a traditional biomechanist. I'm more interested in multiple aspects of the development in children with disabilities and try to use the research and rehabilitation to improve their quality of life. So primarily, I studied children with Down syndrome and cerebral palsy. I'm going to focus on Down syndrome, just use that as an example. So as you may know, Down syndrome is the most common genetic condition, and it occurs in 1 out of 700 newborn infants. Because of their extra chromosome, and children with Down syndrome have huge delays in their motor, cognitive, and language development. So because I'm interested in motor part, and so children with Down syndrome have low muscle tone, low muscle strength, and they have poor coordination. So they have very limited physical activity. Just give you an example. Infants with Down syndrome typically walk at about 2 years of age or even later. And keep in mind, those kids actually start receiving physical therapy at a really young age, but still they are lag behind typical developing kids. So this chart struck me most when I started working with this population. This chart shows age at death, or we call the life expectancy, over the years. So from late 60s to late 90s. Actually, this is the most recent data. There's no additional data published since then. But you can see over the last 40 years, so life expectancy has increased dramatically for all races. But if you look at carefully, and you can see there's a huge gap here between the white population and the Black and other populations. And so there is huge gap in terms of how those people are treated and how they can benefit from the services, medical services, and education services, and in their lives. So this chart struck me most, and I always keep this chart with me when I think about doing research, proposed research study, conduct research, and also educate or mentor my students. I realized that the diversity, equity, inclusion is a big problem, and not only in this population, but maybe much in the broader sense. And so by doing research, I can help to address this question, and I may be able to help to reduce this gap and make sure that everybody can be, realize their lives and live their lives at the full aspect there. So expectation for people with Down syndrome has been really low. In 1970s, most of the children with Down syndrome live in institutions, meaning that they are not living with their families. But over the last 20, 30 years, this has totally changed. I think for now, most children with Down syndrome, they live with their families, and they get much better medical services, educational services. And I just want to show you one Twitter. This is most recent, and I think in last month. So what happens here is the young person in blue, he received a letter, and he get accepted to community college, and he happens to be a person with Down syndrome. Going to college, has never been possible or almost impossible in the past. But with so much support from the society and the advance in the medicine and education and so on, and we have achieved a lot. And look at how he was overwhelmed. He was happy, but he was overwhelmed. So I think that was the message I want to show you, that we are making good progress, but still there are a lot of work we need to do. And we can use our research as a researcher to help improve their quality of life and to help them to live the life as they desire. So my research in Down syndrome include two folds. One is from the clinical side. I studied treadmill training with infants with Down syndrome. We found with training, those infants can start walking by more than 5 months earlier. And also that training has long-term effect by improving their physical activity and even for the long run. I also studied the bone growth and measured the bone mineral density in children with Down syndrome. Again, that's one of my interests. I want to design clinical trials to improve also their bone growth and to help them to be more physically active. From the biomechanical perspective, I studied locomotor development in children with Down syndrome by looking at their walking patterns, hopping, standing, and so on. So again, I'm trying to find the common ground between clinical and biomechanical, and trying to use my biomechanical knowledge to design an intervention study to help children with Down syndrome to improve their motor function, but also beyond that. And maybe we have an impact from the physical intervention on cognitive and language development. And I think that's something more interdisciplinary. And I think that if you want to secure a grant, I think that's the way to go. So from my research experience, I always feel that we deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion all the time. And so if we understand how bad this situation has been and what we can do to actually improve that situation, and maybe we can actually convey that information to my students and let them also think about what they can do in their future career. And so then we can just have the snowballing effect. We have more and more people care about the situation and to kind of try to solve that problem. And I think we can certainly make our society better. So in terms of doctoral student mentoring, and I was fortunate to have diverse and wonderful doctoral students. So I have mentored African Americans, Asian people, Caucasian, Latinx, men and women. So they all came to me with different backgrounds, whether it's biology, physical education, physical therapy, medicine, biomedical engineering. So I was blessed to have such diverse students. And also I'm proud that half of them are women scientists and clinicians. So with their trust, I was striving to do my best to accommodate their needs, to guide them through the doctoral study, and also help them to prepare for their future career. So what I did was that, because I understand everybody is different, they have strengths and weakness, and I was trying to maximize their strengths by giving them some project to lead. But at the same time, I want them to work with other lab members. So by doing this, I was trying to promote the independent research skill and also by cultivating team science, because in the long run, when they do research, they are not going to do research by themselves. They are going to work with the other people. They have to get the communication skills, research skills, and writing skills, and all the skills ready for their future career. And on day one, I would allow them to participate in our clinical research. And by interacting with clinical populations, I hope they understand the special needs from clinical populations and to understand, again, this is part of the diversity issue we do research because we care about this population. Certainly, we want to improve their quality of life, and we want to use our research and go much further distance. Since we have huge undergraduate student body, and a lot of undergraduate students are really interested in getting research experience, even though they may not go to graduate school. So I would ask my doctoral students to mentor undergraduate students. So now my doctoral students are mentee to me, but also the mentor to undergraduate students. So they can learn from both sides. And I think that certainly helped them to understand what is expected as a mentor and also as a mentee. And I think this helped them tremendously before they get started as a junior faculty member upon graduation. I hold weekly group and individual meetings. I think a lot of you guys doing this also. There's nothing special here, but I was trying to create a fair and respectful environment. And I will assign each of students for a project or lead a journal club discussion. But that I will make adjustment along the way. And initially I won't make everybody comfortable, but then I will challenge them, give them like some more challenge work to do and to expand their skill set and to kind of let them know research is not easy work and it's full of challenges. And you have to be prepared to overcome those challenges. You have to find a way. And whether it's solve problems by yourself or work with other people, you have to find a way. But certainly working with other people will be more efficient and will actually help you to grow a lot faster. I had a weekly meeting with each individual, and I truly believe those individual meetings are really, really important. That allows you to get to know your student, not only as a student, but also as a person, because everybody has different barriers and challenges in their lives. And so in our individual meetings, we go over the progress of research projects, but beyond that, we talk about any challenges my students face in their lives. And I was trying really hard to help them to overcome those barriers. I think this is truly wonderful experience to build strong relationship with your students. So you are not only a mentor, you become their friends, lifelong friends. And so certainly I learned a lot from them too. They also pushed me to think hard and think creatively to actually provide the support as I can to my students. So I asked them to, I helped them to prepare the students for their dream career. I encouraged them to think big and aim high. Well, when I was told to receive this award, I thought, oh geez, they really think big and aim high. I did not expect to accept this award at all. Anyway, so from my experience, the mentor and the mentee relationship can be hierarchical because of that the experience you have and your students a lack of experience. But I always think that you have those wonderful experience because you just born a few years earlier than them, and you get a training earlier than them. And so, so there's nothing special about you, and you were a graduate student, some time ago. Now you become the mentor. So you need to understand their situation, and you need to show the respect all the time to your student. And I think treat your student as your child, but here I would say as a child, not exactly as a child, because when you raise your child, you have your spouse watch you and tell you what things you have done wrong, what things you said wrong. But as a mentor to your doctoral students, no one is watching you. So you have to be really careful in terms of word selection when you're during the conversation. When your students make a mistake, you cannot show frustration, because otherwise your students will feel really bad about their mistake. So you want to be really positive. You want to find nice words to encourage them. You want to help them to overcome the barrier. And you kind of encourage them to think that they are able to succeed with right training. Mistakes are mistakes. Everybody has mistakes in their lives. So there's nothing special about those mistakes. But again, try not to do the same mistake twice. That's my message. And also, I think you have to be really patient. You have to be patient to your mentees. They are new to the field. They have a lot to learn. So you need to be patient. You need to design a plan for them, step-by-step plan, and watch them to finish every single milestone. Be patient. When they are lag behind, you want to encourage them and to help them find confidence and let them to know they are able to do that. I think patience will help mentor and mentee go really far. As I said, mentorship is two-way traffic. My students always bring questions to me, ask me questions. Well, whether it's research question, whether it's question in life, but I really appreciate those questions because that allow me to think what I can do in the research, what I can provide, and to improve or prepare them for their future career. I'm really proud that all my former students, doctoral students, landed faculty positions upon graduation. I know this is not easy, but they tried really hard, they work really hard, and I'm really proud of their achievements. So for undergraduate student education, and I always remind myself, I am a college professor, and teaching is one of my primary duties. I have to be an effective teacher, and I need to do my job and to teach my classes well. And so I primarily teach biomechanics classes from undergraduate to master to doctoral levels, especially for undergraduate biomechanics classes. That's not an easy task. And I really appreciate ASB has been organizing the teaching workshops for biomechanics teaching. So for some students, and they a lack of math skills, they always struggle with math problems. What can you do? You have to be creative. You have to be patient. I still remember one example, one African-American student who has really weak math skills, and he struggled on day one of biomechanics class. And he came to my office and asked for help. And we sit down, we talk a long time. And I created a plan for him. I asked him to form a small group with other students and to learn from other students. Also, I asked him to come to my office hours, then we can work together to answer his questions about lecture slides, about homework, about how to prepare for the exam and the quizzes. He worked really hard. And I was really pleased that in the end, he earned a grade of A-. And that's really rewarding experience for me. And the student was also overwhelmed. He has never thought he could earn a grade of A- from biomechanics. And indeed, we tried really hard, and patience pays off. Encouragement pays off. If you trust your student, if you encourage them, and I think they are able to achieve a goal very high and a bar very high. Okay, a lot of undergraduate students are interested in research, so we created independent study and also 1 semester long research internship, and that truly allows undergraduate students to get a glimpse of basics about research and how the research is designed, how the research is done. And also because we have studied with people with disabilities. So those undergraduate students get experience by interacting with those people with disabilities. Because a lot of undergraduate students want to go to PT school, OT school. So this is a very wonderful experience, and they can carry on to their future career and future study. The other thing I did was international outreach. I developed a study abroad program in sport and exercise in China. I collaborated with Beijing Sport University, which is the top sport-related university in China. So we did, I designed a 2-week study abroad program, and which provides students with opportunities to study abroad and get to learn new different culture and different people. this is truly a truly good experience for, especially for underrepresented students. You know, I negotiate with Beijing Sport University for low cost, and also I worked with our international student office, study abroad office at Georgia State, and urged them to provide you know, scholarship, $1,000 for our students who are going to study abroad. And it has been a long process, but I was really pleased that I got support from Beijing Sport University and also Georgia State. And as you can see from those pictures, we have majority of participants from underrepresented populations. I'm really pleased to provide them with this exciting experience. And so over the 2 weeks, those students stayed in student dorms at Beijing Sport University. They used their dining hall. They actually take classes with them. They also take a lot of culture classes, learned traditional Chinese medicine, because a lot of students interested in OTPT, the different perspective in terms of sports and exercise will help them help their future career. So I'm really pleased by the high remarks from those students. They are really excited. They're really pleased with the experience they got from this. So I have been doing this study abroad program for 8 years, and certainly due to pandemic, I was not able to do that over the last 2 years. But certainly I'm going to resume that program in the future to continue to provide that exciting experience to students, especially underrepresented students. I have been a proud member of ASB since 2003 as a doctoral student. And I still remember my first meeting in Toledo, Ohio, and I presented a poster, and I got really good positive feedback. I also feel ASB is my home society. I was welcome. So, and also I'm really excited that ASB is taking the lead in addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in biomechanics field and beyond. And so there are a lot of ongoing conversation about cultural sensitivity and the underrepresented affinity group and so on. And I think those are really nice initiatives to push us think hard and think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look around, there's nothing new, right? And these issues have been there for a long time. We just need to work together, find a solution to solve the problem, to make our society better. So the title of my talk is To the Place We All Dreamed About. So what is that place? And here is the quote from Dr. King's speech, I Have a Dream. I have a dream that all my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this is the place I have been dreaming about. And I hope that is also the place you have been dreaming about. But the question is, are we there yet? Probably not. But I am optimistic that the people and nation are rising up to the challenges. We realize this issue cannot be ignored anymore. We as a researcher can do our part. We can use our study to reduce that gap, close that gap. We can also educate our students and to actually have them help them understand the important diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and help them to develop like right mindset and for their future career. So to summarize my talk, my humble experience teach me I need to be really nice to people, not only to my students, but also to my human subjects in my study and my colleague and everybody. I need to be patient because mentoring is really a long process. So you need to have a plan. You need to be patient to execute that plan. There's always deviation, but don't be panic. Patience will pay off. Be grateful for all the opportunities you have. And whether it is the mentoring opportunity, research opportunity, or even service opportunity, because you will never know what they will lead you to. And a lot of times, it can be really wonderful new opportunities for you. the last but not least, be open-minded. And I think this will help you to understand the not only biomechanics, but also the science better. Being open-minded will help you to get new opportunities to work with the other people and to help, hopefully, that make big change to the society. So I was really grateful to ASB Award Committee for recognizing my little work in diversity mentorship. And also, I'm grateful to all of my doctoral students. I list their names here. Without them, I would not be here, and I would not be actually share my experience. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Wonderful job, Jerry. That was really, truly inspirational. In one of your second to last slides, you mentioned your humility, how humble you are. And that was the word that came to mind when you first started speaking. I thought, oh, you are truly humble. And I just want to reassure you over and over how worthy you are of this award. Your talk today was phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing with us all of your experiences. And it was interesting to see that tie of how that of your appreciation for diversity was from you being a child and seeing it all around you. And so questions are starting to roll in. One thing that struck me was your focus on the individualized needs of the students. And you mentioned the one-on-one meetings that are so crucial. And I think we all appreciate that. I wonder how you're able to prioritize that with all of your other roles. I wonder if you can speak to how you sort of all make that work within your life and your family.
Yeah. So typically we have a weekly meeting, probably let's say Tuesday morning from 10 all the way to 1. And so we have maybe just half an hour group meeting, but for the rest it's all individual meetings. And so we have really long meetings. And I remember one individual meeting lasts for more than an hour. We have so many things to discuss. And so I always leave that time block open because I always want to make sure that I have enough time for my students. I'm available to them. And also tell them that, we just have once weekly meeting, you got to be there. You got that time, reserve that time block for me, because we need to sit down, talk about a lot of things and make a plan. And I think that really works for my students. Sometimes I feel like, I probably ask them too much. And so weekly meeting and check their progress. But I feel like, by doing that, I help them to kind of have like habit of like regular meetings and also have the regular check mark and make sure that they can make progress on a steady basis, not just like, I check you at the end of semester, nothing has been done, then we all mad to each other. That's not the right attitude.
Yes, so those integral intermediate check-ins. Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. So we have a question related to the treadmill stepping training that I think is related to the children with Down syndrome. And the question is, would cycling be similar to treadmill stepping training?
Well, yes. Well, when I studied infants with Down syndrome, so basically the parents hold the infants on top of a small treadmill. And so we allow the infants with Down syndrome practice stepping. Cycling, I think, can be used, but for much older children. And I think that maybe for school-age children with Down syndrome, they can learn those cycling. And actually, one of my former advisor, Dear Arik, did a wonderful study, and he studied adolescents with Down syndrome and teach them how to ride a tricycle, not a bicycle, tricycle, but from tricycle all the way to a bicycle. And he did like summer camp because most of the children with Down syndrome are not able to ride a bike. Even for tricycle, they are not able to do that because of their a lot of like a motor cognitive issues. But through training, with 2 weeks of training, they are able to learn how to ride a tricycle. Some of them can learn how to ride a bicycle. That's just amazing. I think that, with appropriate training intervention, those people can learn. But we just do not have a lot of evidence-based intervention. So that's something we try really hard to gain that experience or evidence to design a study to help them. So I think that's also a wonderful experience for the students. They get first-hand experience working with those people, those special population. They can observe how much improvement those kids can make within 1 week or two. That's just really rewarding experience to them too.
Yeah, that's incredible. All right, next comment and question. Congratulations on such a well-deserved honor and wonderful talk. You mentioned that each student needs a different type of mentorship. I was curious how you go about helping them figure out what they need or how you can best support them in achieving their goals.
Basically, I use research as a tool because, we do a variety of study. We study typical developing children. We study children with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and among others. So I get them exposed to different populations, and because they all want to study biomechanics, but with special populations, I think that prepare them to understand the special needs from these populations. But along the way, because I have really diverse lab, and so and I encourage them to work as a group, not by themselves, and so learn from each other. And whether it's their cultural background, whether it's their how they grow up and the experience they have. So I think learning from each other within the group and beyond is also important, and also encourage them to, do some service if they can in the community, because you are living in the community. So you want to give back to the community. So I have students who has been volunteering and in those local schools and to provide consultation to those special needs kids and to help them to, live better life, and also have other students to do work in the gyms to help people, whether it's healthy people or people with disability, actually to actually increase their physical activity. So I think they can do wonderful things, not only in the lab, but beyond. And they actually learn a lot from all different resources and all different experiences. I think that's wonderful. In terms of biomechanics, certainly when we study, do a research study, we try to maximize diversity. We try to recruit subjects, not only Caucasian, but also African-American, Hispanic people, and to truly have more diverse population. Certainly that helps us to answer the scientific research question, because we understand there may be such a difference across different races, but we always assume that we know that answer, but we may not know that actually. So I think by doing research and interact with diverse human subjects, we also help my students to learn that diversity and equity and inclusion.
Thank you, Jerry. And we have time for one last question. Jerry, congratulations on your award and terrific talk. Your message of increasing diversity, equity, inclusion in the biomechanics community is spot on with ASB's and its members' recent energy. What suggestions do you have for biomechanics researchers for increasing the diversity of their research participants?
I was lucky enough to kind of work at Georgia State University and also in Atlanta. So Atlanta is truly a diverse city, and so we have a high percentage of people who are African American. So it's not hard for us to get those minority people for our research studies. But I think I think you can do your best, and if you're in a small college town, and you may not be able to get as diverse subjects as I can, but you can still think out loud and recruit as many represented subjects as possible. And I think as long as you show efforts and you are trying hard in that direction, and people will appreciate your efforts. And so I acknowledge that not everyone is living in a big city with diverse population. So, but the mindset is important. When you design your study, when you recruit subjects, when you conduct a study, if you have that mindset, and I think that will help you to go a long way. And opportunities happens. Maybe in some time you will do multi-site study. Now suddenly you have diverse population to deal with, and you already prepare yourself for that endeavor. And I think that will be really wonderful experience.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. This has been a wonderful talk and a wonderful session. Thank you to you and Karen both for providing us with a lot of lessons to take away from this. Congratulations to you both, and everyone else, enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Thank you.
Bye.